They had food for 7 years. 129 men entered the Arctic. Not one of them came back. No distress signal, no wreckage washing ashore, no final letter ever made it home. Just 129 of Britain's most experienced sailors, sailing into the frozen north in 1845, and disappearing so completely that the world would spend the next 170 years trying to understand what happened to them. And what they eventually discovered was far worse than anyone expected. Stay with me, because this one goes deeper than most people realize. Before we continue, this channel tells true, human-centered history. If you enjoy this, like, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe. Now, back to the story. To understand why 129 men sailed into the frozen north and never came back, you have to understand what Britain was chasing, and why they wanted it so badly they were willing to risk everything to get it. For 300 years, stop and feel that number for a second. 3 full centuries European explorers had been hunting for what they called the Northwest Passage, a sea route cutting through the frozen Canadian Arctic, linking the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. Find it, navigate it, and you have a shortcut to Asia. You slash thousands of miles off trade routes. You generate fortunes. You rewrite the map of the world. Country after country had tried. Ships had gone in and not come out. Men had starved. And still, after 300 years, nobody had done it. By the 1840s, Britain was convinced the finish line was within reach. They believed only a few hundred miles of the passage remained unmapped. The prize was right there. And here is the context that matters. Britain had just finished decades of war against Napoleon. The Royal Navy was the single most powerful military force on any ocean. But with the wars over, hundreds of decorated, experienced naval officers had nothing to do. So the Admiralty made a decision. Send them north. Channel all that energy and expertise into exploration. Let them finish what 3 centuries of attempts had started. The Arctic had already tested Britain more than once. In 1818, a commander named John Ross turned his entire fleet around because he mistook clouds on the horizon for a mountain range blocking his path. The embarrassment of that decision lingered for years. William Parry followed in 1819, pushed far deeper into Arctic territory than anyone before him, successfully wintered in the ice, and came back alive. The lesson seemed to be that it could be done, that it was just a matter of sending the right people with the right equipment. And then there was John Franklin. Franklin had been to the Arctic twice before, both times overland, not by sea. His first expedition in 1819 ended in catastrophe. 11 of his 20 men died from starvation, exposure, and what some historians believe was murder among the survivors. Franklin himself lived partly by boiling and chewing his own leather boots for sustenance. That is not poetic language. That literally happened. His men gave him a nickname that followed him for the rest of his life: the man who ate his boots. His second overland expedition in 1825 recovered his reputation considerably. He mapped thousands of miles of Arctic coastline, returned with all his men, and became a celebrated figure in British scientific circles. So by 1845, Franklin was a knight, a polar veteran, and a national hero. He was also 59 years old, and the man who arguably should have been given command of this expedition was his second in command, an Irish captain named Francis Crozier. Crozier had sailed to the Arctic multiple times. He had been to Antarctica. He had more relevant ice experience than almost any other naval officer alive. But Crozier was Irish, and in the rigid, class-conscious world of Victorian Britain, that mattered more than his qualifications. Franklin got the command. What makes this worse is that Crozier knew something was wrong before they even left. He reportedly wrote letters before departure, expressing serious anxiety about the expedition. He had doubts, deep ones. He went anyway. That decision would cost him everything. Now let me tell you about the ships, because they deserve more than a passing mention. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror were extraordinary vessels. They were bomb ships, a category of warship built so massively reinforced that they could absorb the violent recoil of naval mortars without tearing apart. That structural density made them ideal candidates for battering through Arctic ice. Before the expedition sailed, both ships were upgraded specifically for what lay ahead. Iron-reinforced bows for ramming frozen water, retractable propellers and rudders that could be pulled up inside the hull to protect them from crushing ice. Central heating systems running hot water through pipes below decks to keep the men warm through polar winters. They also had steam engines. Erebus carried a 25-horsepower locomotive engine. Terror had a 20-horsepower one. In 1845, this was genuinely cutting-edge technology. These ships could move independent of wind. They could maneuver through ice leads where a traditional sailing vessel would be completely helpless. And the supplies. Over 32,000 kilograms of tinned food, flour, chocolate, lemon juice for scurvy prevention, alcohol, tobacco, a library of more than 1,000 books, musical instruments, hand organs, fine china, silverware engraved with each officer's personal family crest. The Victorians did not do things halfway. The expedition left the Thames on the 19th of May, 1845, to enormous public fanfare. Crowds packed the riverbanks. Newspapers celebrated the departure. 129 of Britain's finest were going to solve the last great Arctic mystery and return home as legends. They stopped briefly in Greenland to drop off 5 men deemed unfit for service, reducing the crew to 129. Then they crossed Baffin Bay and headed west. In late July 1845, 2 British whaling vessels, the Enterprise and the Prince of Wales, encountered Erebus and Terror in Baffin Bay. The ships were moored to an iceberg, waiting for conditions to open up before entering Lancaster Sound. The whalers reported the men were healthy, in excellent spirits, well-stocked and eager. Franklin told them he had provisions for 5 to 7 years. That was the last confirmed sighting of the expedition by any European. After that silence, for the first couple of years, Britain was not particularly worried. Expeditions disappeared into the Arctic for extended stretches all the time. 2 years without contact was normal. 3 years started to feel uncomfortable. By 1847, a quiet unease had settled over the Admiralty. What nobody knew, what nobody on the outside could possibly have known, was what had already happened inside the ice. Here is what we now believe, based on evidence painstakingly assembled over the following century and a half. After the whalers spotted them in Baffin Bay, Franklin sailed west through Lancaster Sound and into Barrow Strait, reaching Cornwallis Island. Then, rather than heading immediately south, which would have been the most direct course toward the Northwest Passage, he turned north to investigate Wellington Channel. Historians have argued about this decision ever since. Was it scientific curiosity? Was it a strategic miscalculation? Was it early evidence of compromised judgment? Nobody has a definitive answer. He eventually circled back and chose to spend the first winter at Beechey Island, a small, bleak, exposed island off the southwestern corner of Devon Island. The ships froze into the ice. Winter closed in. And during that first winter, 3 men died. Their names were John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Brain. They were buried in marked graves on the island's shore. Those graves would eventually become one of the most important physical clues in the entire investigation. We will come back to what was found inside them. When summer arrived in 1846 and the ice loosened, Franklin made his move. He pushed south through a route called Peel Sound that no European ship had ever attempted. This was actually the correct decision. This was the right course for the Northwest Passage. The ships made strong, steady progress southward along the western coast of King William Island. And then came the 12th of September, 1846. The ice closed in again. The ships locked into the pack ice of Victoria Strait, northwest of King William Island. Approximate position, 70 degrees north latitude, 98 degrees west longitude. And unlike the previous winter at Beechy Island, this ice was not going to release them. Not that autumn, not the following summer, not ever. But here is where the story begins to change in ways that nobody at the time could fully understand. Think about what those men were living through. Frozen solid, unable to move the ships, entirely dependent on the provisions they had brought. One Arctic winter passed. Then the summer of 1847 arrived, and the ice held. No lead opened. No escape route appeared. The ship sat motionless in the frozen sea. That second failed summer was the turning point. One winter in the ice was a manageable, if difficult, situation. 2 consecutive years without any thaw was a catastrophe. Men began dying at an accelerating rate, and the reasons why, when forensic scientists began piecing it together more than a century later, turned out to be even more disturbing than simple starvation or cold. And this is the part of the story that genuinely changes how you see everything that came before. Those 32,000 kilograms of tinned food, the provisions that were supposed to sustain 129 men for up to 7 years, were sealed with lead solder. Poor quality work, done quickly, with thick, uneven beads of lead running along the interior seams of the cans. Lead leaches into food. It leaches faster when food is heated. And these men were heating their food every single day, in the Arctic cold, for years on end. They were being slowly poisoned by the very supplies that were meant to keep them alive. Forensic analysis of remains recovered from the expedition revealed lead concentrations in bone and hair samples that researchers describe as dramatically, in some cases, acutely elevated. And lead poisoning does not only destroy the body, it dismantles the mind. Fatigue, depression, irritability, cognitive decline, impaired decision-making, confusion that deepens gradually over time, so slowly that the person experiencing it may not even be aware it is happening. If these men were suffering from chronic lead poisoning, and the evidence strongly points in that direction, then their capacity to think clearly, lead effectively, and respond rationally to a worsening crisis may have been steadily eroding for months before the final collapse. That is a deeply unsettling thought when you consider the decisions that followed. On top of the lead, scurvy was almost certainly advancing. Despite carrying lemon juice, years of subsisting primarily on tinned food without adequate fresh meat or vegetables depletes vitamin C to critical levels. Scurvy causes pain in the joints so intense that wounds that had healed years earlier can reopen. It causes weakness that leaves strong men unable to lift themselves from a bunk. Bone analysis of recovered remains also showed evidence of tuberculosis, a disease so widespread in 19th century Britain that some of these men likely boarded the ships in 1845, already carrying it in their lungs. Then add the weight of 2 Arctic winters, the dwindling food, the isolation and darkness, the grief of watching shipmates die one by one, the knowledge, growing slowly and then overwhelmingly, that no one was coming. And then add this. On the 11th of June, 1847, Sir John Franklin died. The exact cause is not recorded and has never been confirmed. He was 61 years old, He had been trapped in ice for nearly 2 years. He was buried at sea, or on the ice itself, and his body has never been recovered. Command passed to Francis Crozier, the man who had been right to be worried, the man who had been passed over for this command because of where he was born. He now had to find a way to save 105 men, because by April of 1848, 24 members of the expedition were already dead. 1 in 5 men gone before the hardest part had even begun. On the 22nd of April, 1848, a note was written. It was sealed inside a metal canister and placed inside a stone cairn at a location on King William Island that searchers would later name Victory Point. That note is the only written document ever recovered from the Franklin expedition. It is, in many ways, one of the most haunting pieces of paper that has ever been pulled from the ground. The document was actually 2 separate messages layered onto the same sheet of paper. The first had been written in May 1847 by a lieutenant named Graham Gore. It was a routine status report. 2 ships beset in the ice since September 1846. Franklin in command. All well. All well. Then someone came back to that note, almost exactly 1 year later, Crozier and another officer named Captain Fitzjames, and filled the margins with desperate, crowded handwriting. Franklin was dead. 23 additional men had died. They were abandoning both ships the following day. 105 survivors would begin marching south toward the Back River on the Canadian mainland. The Back River, also known as the Great Fish River, approximately 1,100 kilometers away, across King William Island, across the Adelaide Peninsula, through terrain that would challenge a well-equipped, physically healthy overland expedition. These men were not healthy. They were not well-equipped for an overland journey. They were already compromised, weakened by scurvy, by lead poisoning, by months of insufficient food, by years of accumulated illness. And they were planning to drag heavy wooden lifeboats on sledges across that landscape. Why the Back River? Because it connected, eventually, to the Canadian interior, and to fur trading posts where there was the possibility of reaching help. A British explorer named John Back had descended it in the 1830s. It was the only route that Crozier could see as potentially viable. It was not a plan born of confidence. It was a plan born of desperation. The men loaded the boats. They walked off the ships and onto the ice, and they began marching. What happened on that march is something we know almost entirely from 2 sources. The testimony of the Inuit people who encountered the dying men, and the physical evidence scattered across the landscape, bones, equipment, and abandoned objects that search parties found over the following decades. What both sources describe is harrowing. The Inuit had lived in this part of the Arctic for thousands of years. They knew the ice, the roots, the animals, the land. When British search expeditions eventually began asking what the Inuit had witnessed in the years after 1848, the accounts they received were precise and consistent. A large group of men dragging heavy boats, visibly emaciated, barely able to walk, some collapsing and dying on the march itself, a tent discovered containing between 30 and 40 bodies, men trying to communicate through gesture because the language barrier was complete. And something else. Something Victorian Britain was wholly unprepared to hear. The Inuit described human bones, with cut marks, cracked open, placed in cooking vessels over fires. The evidence of what is known in forensic terms as survival cannibalism. The Scottish explorer John Ray brought this information back to Britain in 1854, along with physical artifacts he had obtained from the Inuit silverware, a personal medal belonging to Franklin himself, and other items from the ships. He reported what the Inuit had told him accurately and without embellishment. And Britain came apart. Charles Dickens. The Charles Dickens, The most celebrated novelist in the English-speaking world wrote furious published responses, insisting that the Inuit must themselves have committed the acts they described. He could not accept the alternative, that Royal Navy officers, British gentlemen, could have done what the evidence suggested. The racist assumptions built into that response were obvious then to anyone willing to look, and are obvious now to everyone. John Ray was publicly attacked. His reputation took lasting damage. He received the £10,000 prize for determining the fate of the expedition, but he was never celebrated as a hero, not in his lifetime. He was also right. Modern forensic analysis of bones recovered along the march route has confirmed the Inuit accounts. Cut marks on human bones consistent with flesh removal, marrow extraction, blade marks on skulls. These men, in their final weeks, did what people on the absolute edge of survival sometimes do. They used every available means to stay alive a little longer. And still they all perished. What happened next is the detail that stays with you long after everything else fades. Among the objects found abandoned along the death march items that weakening, dying men had nonetheless continued dragging on sledges across the tundra. Searchers found a copy of a Victorian novel called The Vicar of Wakefield, curtain rods, fine silk handkerchiefs, a lightning rod, engraved silverware. Why would men who were starving and dying carry a lightning rod across the Arctic? The most credible explanation forensic researchers and historians have offered is cognitive impairment. Brains slowly eroded by years of lead exposure, no longer able to clearly assess what was essential and what was not. Men who intellectually understood they were dying, but could not let go of the objects that connected them to the civilization they had left behind. It is one of the quietest and most devastating details in the entire story. While all of this was unfolding in the Arctic, a campaign of an entirely different kind was being waged back in Britain. Lady Jane Franklin was not a woman who grieved quietly and waited for news. She was sharp, politically connected, strategically minded, and absolutely relentless in her pursuit of answers. As the years of silence accumulated, she wrote letters to the Admiralty, to politicians, to foreign governments. She organized public pressure. When official search efforts stalled or seemed inadequate, she funded expeditions herself. Between 1848 and the late 1850s, more than 30 separate search expeditions were dispatched into the Arctic, looking for Erebus and Terror and their crew. 30. The combined scope of these searches inadvertently produced more geographical knowledge of the Canadian Arctic than any deliberate survey mission before or since. Vast portions of the northern map that had been blank were charted by people looking for Franklin's men. In 1850, a large fleet found Beechey Island and the 3 graves from the first winter. But there were no messages left in any cairn, no record of where the expedition had gone next, which was baffling and remained a puzzle for years. Those graves became the center of a remarkable scientific event in 1984, when a researcher named Owen Beatty was granted permission to exhume them. What his team found stopped the scientific world cold. The bodies of John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Brain were almost perfectly preserved by the permafrost. Their faces were still recognizable. Their clothing was intact. They looked as though they had been buried weeks ago, not 138 years earlier. Tissue analysis confirmed extremely elevated lead levels, confirmed tuberculosis. Torrington's expression, frozen into permanence by the Arctic, was described by those who saw it as one of pain. The photographs from that exhumation became some of the most widely reproduced images in the history of Arctic exploration. For the first time, people were not looking at an abstraction. They were looking at a face. In 1859, a naval officer named Francis Leopold McClintock leading a privately funded expedition organized by Lady Jane Franklin, found the Victory Point note on King William Island and recovered extensive physical evidence of the expedition's final months. The broad outlines of what had happened were finally, painfully, clear. But the ships were still missing, and they would remain missing for more than a century and a half. In 2014, a Parks Canada underwater survey, guided significantly by Inuit traditional knowledge that had been maintained in living memory for generations, located HMS Erebus on the floor of Queen Maud Gulf. The wreck was remarkably well preserved. 2 years later, in 2016, the Arctic Research Foundation found HMS Terror in a bay that had been named Terror Bay long before anyone knew the ship was there. The coincidence is uncomfortable enough that it almost does not feel like one. Terror's condition was extraordinary. Windows unbroken, cabinets still closed, bottles upright on shelves. The preservation was so exceptional that some researchers have proposed the ship was not simply abandoned and left to drift. The evidence suggests it may have been sailed deliberately to that location, possibly by a small group of survivors who returned to the vessel after the main abandonment and managed to get it moving one last time before it finally went under. That possibility is still being investigated. Both wrecks are active archaeological sites. Divers descend every season. New artifacts surface. New data comes in. The wrecks are legally protected under a bilateral agreement between Canada and the United Kingdom, and the Inuit community of Joa Haven is formally involved in their ongoing research and stewardship. The ships are still giving up their secrets, slowly, on their own terms. So why does this still matter? Why, more than 170 years later, are historians writing books, filmmakers making series, and divers going down into freezing Arctic water to recover buttons and navigational instruments from a Victorian disaster? Because the Franklin expedition is not simply a story about what went wrong on one ill-fated mission. It is a story about what happens when a civilization becomes so convinced of its own superiority that it stops being able to see clearly. When the most advanced technology of an era proves completely inadequate against an environment it does not understand. When the accumulated knowledge of people who have lived in a place for thousands of years is dismissed because those people do not fit the image of who is supposed to have answers. The Inuit knew how to survive in the Canadian Arctic. They wore the clothing that actually kept you warm in that climate. They ate the food that actually nourished you in those conditions. They knew the routes, the ice behavior, the seasonal patterns, the animals. When Roald Amundsen of Norway finally became the first person to successfully navigate the Northwest Passage in 1903 to 1906, with a small ship and a minimal crew, a significant part of his approach involved deliberately learning from the Inuit, their clothing, their methods, their knowledge of the land. He accomplished in 3 years what the Royal Navy had failed to do in more than 3 centuries of trying, and he did it largely by doing the opposite of what Franklin did. He listened. 129 men left England in May of 1845, carrying every advantage their civilization could provide. The finest ships ever sent into the Arctic, enough food for 7 years, steam engines, libraries, fine silverware, and not one of them came home. The last survivor probably died somewhere on the Adelaide Peninsula in 1848 or 1849, too far from help, too broken to take another step. No body was ever sent home. No final letter was ever delivered. No one ever sat in a warm room and told the story of what they had seen. There are still bones on King William Island. There are still 2 ships on the ocean floor, their cabinets closed, their bottles still standing, keeping their silence in the dark. The Franklin expedition did not end with a rescue, or a discovery, or a moment of resolution. It ended with the ice, And the ice, to this day, has not given everything back. Some stories do not have endings. Some silences are too deep to fill. And some questions, even 180 years later, with satellites and sonar and diving teams, remain exactly where the Arctic put them. Unanswered, unforgiven, unforgotten. What do you think really happened out there? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more true stories like this, subscribe. The next one might be even darker. Because some stories never really end.